Well. Hello, hello, and welcome back, everyone, to Starbright podcast. We missed episode 2 weeks ago. Just everyone busy with life, as it happens occasionally. Again, I gotta make a Twitter or something where updates that I can link to this so people can know when we're gonna be skipping an episode. Because right now, there's no way of notifying anyone, and I feel kind of bad when we just don't show up. But we'll figure out something to do there. Today's episode 20. If everyone recalls, I believe today's episode is Stereotypes of Kink. So not stuff intrinsically in kink, but more like the general stereotypes that people outside the scene have of people who are inside the scenes. I'd like to say kink is, it's not really hidden behind the veil, but it's not, I guess it's not very publicly accessible generally. And so there's a lot of people that aren't in the scene that don't really understand anything about it outside of how they see it portrayed in popular media. And so
Because it's
we're
taboo,
gonna
it's a
talk
little
about
bit
that.
mystified.
Yeah, and in a pretty big way, which is a shame because the very basics of kink, and I've said this before, it's really just what would be a way to put it? It's really just the open exploration of someone's sexual interests, or both people's sexual interests, I should say, or
Well,
more if it's more
it's
people in
not
that
even
relationship.
sexual. It's not even
Doesn't have to
sexual.
be.
It can be sexual. It can be very sexual, but it's also when I talk to people, I sometimes say, and I'm pretty sure I've said it on the podcast a couple of times, I see a huge overlap between neurodivergence and kink. I would say it's almost 100%. The Venn diagrams are basically a circle. And I argue very strongly that kink, BDSM, and the stimulus that is thought in general is like the biggest stim seeking behavior. You don't have to sexualize it in order for it to be fulfilling and stim seeking and uh, you really get something out of it. It does not have to be sexual. And I think that's a very, very, very common misconception and stereotype in kink that is like the biggest overall arching thing. It doesn't have to be sexual. And there's too much out there that portrays kink as sexual, which is damaging to people who are, say, on the ace spectrum, who still want to engage in kink,
That's very true.
but that isn't something they're seeking. They're not sexual at all. And some people, they look at kink and they assume there's a hypersexuality aspect. Well, that's true for me and probably several of the other people in here. It's not true for everybody. A lot of people that are very hard on the ace spectrum and are only periodically interested in kink are very, well, not kink, how do I say it? They're very interested in like sex only seldom or with one particular partner. They can be extremely into kink, but not usually practice it sexually. Like shibari is often practiced in a non-sexual way as a end of the day release because like the pressure on the chest from the way the ropes are tied is very, very calming to some people. And that's completely non-sexual.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that there is a lot of non-sexual stuff, but that's not the stuff that we see, especially when it comes to stereotypes of kink, right? That's not
Mhm.
they're not we don't see in popular media someone just going around wearing a body harness but otherwise naked at home, just enjoying themselves in their own little self tie. That's not what's shown. The stereotype is that it's sex addicts and sex fiends, and it's all about the more taboo the better, and the more
Everybody's
dangerous
got
the
a
better.
dungeon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the stereotype that I think most people have
You
of
don't
kink.
have to have a sex dungeon to be into kink. Full disclosure, it's not necessary. It's fun, but it's not necessary.
Certainly helps.
Like it can help. Yeah, you have to have like a
Depending on what
storage
you're
pod
into.
for some of your equipment. Yeah. Depending what you're in, there's a lot of equipment involved, but you can always just have a little bag under your bed too, and it doesn't have to be sexual. And that's something I run into a lot on my page a few weeks ago. I posted about littles, and most practice of little space is fairly non-sexual. There's some people who do sexualize little space. It can be a touchy subject. I personally don't think it's a great idea. I'm not going to knock it if that's your thing, but it doesn't really make us look like we're just innocently acting like littles, because then the assumption is that pedophilia is involved. And I've had to explain repeatedly, like, well, most people who are practicing little space aren't usually using it sexually. In fact, the practice of little space sexually is actually very taboo even for us. Within our community, it's really a big taboo subject to sexualize little space. And I don't feel like that's necessarily conveyed well to the vanilla public at large, that there are things for us that are taboo for us as well, that are
Mm.
not necessarily something that we all approve of. We are aware it exists, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's approved of in the larger kink BDSM community.
I mean, in and of itself, like that, like not every person into kink is into kink, like 100%. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's another thing that people are like, oh, you're into BDSM or whatever. Not everybody who's into kink is into BDSM, even. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's,
Yes, there is an
everything's a
unfortunate,
spectrum.
yeah, there's an unfortunate uh, misconception that kink and BDSM are synonymous. They are not. They are not synonyms. They can be interchanged periodically, but you do have to be careful about that. With BDSM, there's an inherent power exchange that occurs, whereas kink is just any taboo out of the ordinary practice. And a lot of the definitions out there say that it's a taboo or out of the ordinary sexual practice, but that is also extremely incorrect. Kink does not have to be sexual. BDSM does not have to be sexual. So I think the big thing to remember here is not only are those two different words with different meanings, if we overlap them and assume inherent sexuality, we're going to automatically run into some pretty big negative stereotypes that we're going to run into. Like if I say that I'm into something, like I'm into bondage or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to be in bondage and use sexually. I mean, sometimes it's just people enjoy being tied up, people enjoy rope play. Rope play does not have to end in a sexual encounter in order for it to be fulfilling for all parties involved. Not all riggers and rope bunnies end up having sex. It's not necessary to get the same enjoyment.
Yeah,
Also, like,
and
there you go.
no, I was just gonna say there are a lot of aspects that are non-sexual, like you said. So I mean, we've talked about it before. There are some simple, like very kink related things that people do that aren't sexual. I mean, the inherent uh, rules to kink about being honest and open about your communications and doing research into dangers of things and whatnot, that just applies to everything. I'd say those are really the ground rules of kink, and that applies to every relationship, everything you do in your life. Hopefully, I would hope so. That's just a good background to everything. So like, it's just the stereotypes just don't display any of that.
Yeah. It's a really common trend to look at somebody who's into kink and assume that they're using it sexually. And a lot of the reason that littles and people who enjoy little space or middle space run into really negative problems is people look at it and they go, well, age regression is a mental illness. Well, it's not. Like by itself, it's not a mental illness. It can be a symptom of mental illness. But this was another thing that came up on that same post that I did last week or the week before. People kept saying, "Oh, well, if you're age regressing, it's a sign of mental illness," but that's not entirely the case either. In fact, even the literature out there for psychologists looking at this, it acknowledges that little space can be a really healthy form of uh, a coping mechanism. It's how you deal with things, and as with any coping mechanism, as long as you're not completely avoiding dealing with things, it can be very, very helpful. However, people associate it with the negative aspects of some sort of mental illnesses. They assume that it means there's something wrong with you because there's assumption of sexuality involved. The assumption that you're some sort of sexual predator of some kind, which is very much not the case. But there's a lot of layers of assumptions that are made about adults who are acting out of the ordinary. And that must mean that there's something wrong with us or wrong with them, or we're doing things that are wrong. When in fact, if you look at the psychological analysis that goes into these things, most of the time it's actually either a neutral or a positive experience psychologically from all the data that's out there. But there is an assumption that is made by the average person that because we are doing things differently, there is something wrong with us. And they
It's
don't
like,
seem to appreciate that the people who are practicing this, there's doctors who do this, there's uh,
mm,
people in politics who do this, there's people who are in the sciences who are really well respected professors. Like, if you actually look at who's doing this, it's not just like the quote unquote freaks of society. There's a lot of people who are engaged in these things. And overall, the psychological look at these things is actually very positive.
It's like the
Sorry.
that sort no, that's fine. There's sort of just the trope of like you see like a woman who um like enjoys or wants sex, and they're like, oh, she's got daddy issues. You know what I mean? It's just like that. It's simple as that. As people being like, well, you know,
because she has,
a woman who enjoys sex,
sexual wants.
that's taboo.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's. But on the completely opposite side of littles, but also on the same sort of vein is also like people who are into CNC, like that can be a way to process trauma, and oftentimes feel like, well, you're into CNC, like, you know, there's trauma there you have to work through, you know, and that's not the case, you know, and it
I
can
ran into
be
this
used
a
the right
lot.
way, obviously, but
I would argue very
it's not
strongly you should be
inherent.
so careful with using CNC for any type of therapy like that. Um, I I personally am not traumatized in that way. It's like one of the few types of trauma badges I have not earned, which is it's not something that people assume. Like if somebody finds out that I'm into CNC, 9 out of 10, they are going to assume that I had some sort of brutal essay in my past that I'm trying to deal with, and that's why I'm into CNC. But that's not true for me. And there's this assumption that everyone who is into CNC is in it due to trauma. And yes, I am a supremely traumatized person, but like my trauma is not sexual in nature. Therefore, for me, CNC is not like reclaiming my power. I just happen to enjoy being hurt. So it's more or less my masochism on display rather than like a trauma response or a trauma coping mechanism. But
Mhm.
there is a huge assumption that the fact that I enjoy this must mean that I am sexually traumatized or hurt, or I can no longer enjoy things the correct way because I did not have like a healthy introduction to sex. But that's very far from the truth for me. And I recognize that there's a lot of people who use CNC in that way. But as with any coping mechanism, if you're going to use something like CNC to cope with your past trauma, make sure that you are actually dealing with it other ways besides just in CNC too. It should not be your only way to address your past trauma with sexual assault.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I would hope that people aren't doing that. I think we talked about that before in another episode. Because like if you're trying to do that, you're making your partner be your therapist essentially. You're putting them
Hmm.
through something that they didn't necessarily agree to do, and probably shouldn't have to deal with. And you're foisting, that's serious stuff, and you're foisting all
Hmm.
of the possible side effects, all of the possible outcomes onto that person. And unless they're like also a licensed, therapist or psychologist or something. And I don't, that's I hopefully not the one you're going to for your problems. Then
Yeah,
like, it's unfair to put that on them.
I have
That being said,
spoken
it can be
to.
good for, a version of like exposure therapy. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about using that to help cope. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I have had experiences with someone that was like that, who had problems with physical abuse and but liked to be slapped. And then sometimes we just had to stop. A safe word was said and we just had to stop, make sure she was okay, before we did anything else, because that would trigger something in her every once in a while. But outside of that, she really liked it because it was a form of coping, because she knew she was in control of that and that it could stop anytime she wanted it to be. But
Exactly.
it was not the primary way she dealt with it though.
Exactly. And that's a big thing. I've run into DOMs that I've spoken to over the years that one of them really stood out to me. He had been talking to this girl for a while. They'd been intimate a couple of times, but she was really interested in trying a CNC scene. And they weren't partners, but they'd had enough encounters that he felt pretty comfortable with it. And it was like, well, if that's what you want, then I'm down for it. What she had not communicated and failed to communicate between that point, the last time they'd had an encounter, and when she contacted him, was that she had been sexually assaulted in that time between. And she was going to try CNC in order to try to reclaim her power. But she never told him, did not disclose any of that information, why she was interested in trying it. And when he, went to start the scene, she screamed bloody murder and just freaked out, crying, sobbing, slapping him, and he had no idea what was going on. He ended up just leaving because he was so freaked out. And she told him later, and he felt extremely betrayed by this because this could have ended so badly for both of them because she failed to communicate something that was critically important.
Yeah, no kidding.
And that's a big risk. So I'm always a little hesitant about people who are telling you they want to try CNC to try to address their trauma because I'm immediately like, well, what else have you tried first? Because this should not be your first line of defense. And within our community, I think most of us have an understanding of this too. There is an assumption being made about us that we just do this willy nilly, that we're not really thinking about it or the ramifications, we're not really addressing things. But the overarching theme is there is concern that this should not be your main way of dealing with things. The assumption is that we are not dealing with our problems appropriately, but in our community, that is an emphasis. Most people in our community who are into CNC recognize that you need to be dealing with things appropriately before trying to heal with CNC or any other type of exposure therapy like impact. If you have trauma around impact or gunplay or knife play, those should not be your first line of defense. You should have already dealt with these things as best as you can through therapy prior to trying this.
But
Otherwise, it's going to end up hurting everybody.
that of course isn't the stereotype, though, since we're
There
talking about
is a
stereotypes.
stereotype made about it. People
Yeah,
assume that we're damaged.
that's exactly it, right? That's the
Mhm.
stereotype. We're all you. There's no reason for you to want any of these things. There's no reason for you to enjoy any of these things unless there's something wrong with you. You've come through something traumatic, or that's it. There's
Well,
no possible way. There's no other
the
meaning to any of
reason
it.
I bring this up is this is actually a conversation I had on this same post with somebody who identified as a psychologist. I'm not sure I buy it, but he said he was a psychologist. And it was an assumption, according to him, that in psychology that we are doing this because we are damaged and we're not dealing with our problems the correct way. And he was talking about how we get into these weird sexual things because we never actually went to therapy. And if we did, we wouldn't want to do these things. It's not the first time I've heard this, but hearing somebody who claims to be a psychologist say that was a bit alarming to me because apparently that is a stereotype about us that we are doing these things and claiming it's as a coping mechanism when in fact we aren't actually dealing with our problems appropriately. But that's not true at all. Like we are very, very big on we are a pro therapy crowd, actually. I don't
Mm.
think I've met very many people in our circle or like in our what do we call it, like the new guard age group. I don't know of anyone who is in this group that is not extremely pro therapy. I think we're all pretty pro therapy at this point.
Well, it's
Uh,
communication. That's why. Like, it's paramount. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
and
so if
therapy
you're not in
helps you learn to
therapy, like,
communicate.
that's yeah.
First time chatter says, please tell that psychologist my therapist of 3 years says hi. Laugh my ass off. But the I
Yeah.
and that's I would feel like most psychologists and most therapists would so strongly disagree with that. I mean, I
Yeah. I
to
will
reveal a
note he
little bit of
deleted his
background,
comment after he got his ass lit up by
very understandable
another psychologist. Another
because
psychologist showed up, lit his ass up, and that comment mysteriously deleted itself.
I was a care counselor at a drug and alcohol abuse rehab facility for a long time, and if you've ever been involved in that industry, a lot of people in that industry, you'd be aware that most of the times drug addiction is a symptom. And a lot of people that have drug addiction have been through very traumatic things. And so therapy is an enormous part of that process. And the way that I have heard it put in the past, the way that I like to think about it, is that there are very few right ways to deal with anything. There is no
Mhm.
this is not some road that you're just walking down. That's not what life is. Everyone has different circumstances, and the entire point of most therapy is for someone to help you get outside of your own perspective so you can see things more clearly and deal with them easier, because we're all very much chained by our own little psychological chains. We all think we can't do this or can't do that, and we're stuck in a rut and we're stuck doing this and that, when really, there's nothing preventing anyone from just up and changing their name and moving halfway across the country and being an entirely different person if you want to be a different person. There's honestly nothing physically preventing you from doing that, generally speaking, but we have our own psychological chains, and therapy is supposed to help you get over them. Now, normally it's to help you get over problems that you're experiencing, and not necessarily for anything else, but therapy is not supposed to be some guy sitting there and tell you, no, you're wrong for this or you're wrong for that, Because again, unless you're going out and purposely hurting others, there really isn't a wrong path. You're free to live however you want. There's not really a wrong way to live as long as you're happy with yourself. So that telling someone who's into kink, like, hey, the stereotypes I have of kink that I got from 50 Shades of Grey says you must like being abused and you must be an abused person, because that's what that movie told me is right. That's ridiculous. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And it couldn't be more wrong. And more of an incorrect way to look at the community and people who are in kink and what we actually do and what we're about, because that's just none of that is accurate.
I
And
completely agree.
I would put my doubts that that person was any kind of professional, because that just doesn't sound
He
right from
was
my experience.
claiming that what did he say? He had PTSD and he went to therapy and did things the right way, and then he became a therapist
The right way.
and a psychologist. He had a doctorate. And I lit into him because he was quoting things that were not actually said in the literature. And I don't think he realized that my degrees are in the sciences and I'm not the person you want to fucking lie to when the literature you gave me is right in front of my face and I can see that it doesn't say that. So I'm ripping into him, and a couple of other psychologists and health professionals hopped in. We're like, no, in my practice, like, we recognize that there is age regression used as a recreational form of coping mechanism. And as long as it's used as safely as any other coping mechanism, remember, coping mechanisms don't necessarily have to be a positive. They can be a neutral, but still have a positive outcome. As long as you're not doing something that is inherently harmful, your therapist is probably going to be like, I'd rather you do this than self harm. It's
Oh yeah.
probably better that you do this than avoid dealing with it altogether. I would rather you do something that maybe is delaying you deal with things, but helping you feel better and deal with it on your terms when you're able to.
Yep.
And I think a lot
Or
of
take it out on
people,
someone else too.
yeah, like, a lot of people aren't really acknowledging the importance of coping mechanisms and how they work. Like, as long as your coping mechanism is being used appropriately, there's a lot of things that can be coping mechanisms. And if that happens to be like extremely brutal CNC, cool. If it happens to be a little space that is completely non sexualized, also fantastic. All of these are a net win as long as it's helping you work through what you need to and you're using it appropriately.
Yep. And you especially shouldn't be letting anyone else tell you, that their stereotypes of your experience is what's correct, and they should know, better than you about what's that about. If you're being into kink and someone tells you, oh, you like being tied up, well, XYZ must be true about you, and you must have all these other problems. Like, don't listen to that. It's bullshit. They don't know you.
It's
Exactly.
a lot like genres, flavors of kink, sort of umbrella terms as well. Like, you say, I like being tied up. That could mean a myriad of things. It's just
Mhm.
a quick, explanation to point someone in the right direction. In the same way that like sexualities or genders don't always fit exactly the box, but when you're talking to somebody else and you don't want to have to explain the intricacies of who you are as a person, like, just pointing
Mhm.
them in the mostly right direction it is sometimes all the conversation needs, so you don't get bogged down in the in the minutiae of the whole thing. And so,
Exactly.
kink is like that. You can be like, I like being tied up, but that could mean shibari. It could just mean like a tiny bit of rope play. It could mean cuffs even. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't need to be,
Mhm.
but it just gives people a vague idea of
What
what
you're
you might be
into.
interested in. Even. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's
Yeah.
a big thing is even within kink, we make assumptions about people sometimes when they say things to us. Like, if somebody walks up to you at a convention, they say, I'm a hard dom, you're kind of like, okay. Well, hard doms generally are a bit of an asshole. Not always, but like, they can be a lot of an asshole. And there's a reason they're being a hard dom. And that is an assumption that a lot of people make when they meet hard doms. Like, one thing I think a lot of vanilla people think when they meet doms is that they're all hard doms, that they all just want to really degrade and dehumanize women and just like be brutal and awful. Not all doms are like that though. We also have soft doms. There's doms who are somewhere in the middle. There's primal doms. Like, there's a lot of different types of doms. But I think a lot of people when they think about doms, they think hard dom if they're from outside of the community. And even within the community, we do make assumptions about people based off what they identify as. A hard dom's usually pretty rough and tumble. They can be a bit of an asshole. Soft doms usually I wouldn't say a pushover, but some brats especially might see soft doms as a pushover. It really depends on who you're talking to, but there are assumptions that are made when people identify that way. One of the reasons I wanted to bring up this particular subject was brats. There's a lot of assumptions made about brats before you ever get to meet the brat. And very, very few of those assumptions are fair. Brats have overall a very negative rap in the community, and that is partially due to the assumptions and labels that have been given to them by the old guard. People who were in the older eras of Kink and BDSM, the smart mouth masochists, or the idea that brats are just poorly behaved subs. Like that is a very, very common trope. It's not necessarily fair or true, but people see a brat and one of the first things they think is, oh, you just can't behave and you just want somebody to slap you around. And no, that's not true of me at all, actually. But yeah, these are assumptions that are made within the community too. And people who are outside the community are just unaware and they're going to take up on the first clues that they see. And if our community is already talking about brats as being bad subs, then that's what the general consensus of the vanillas is going to be too. And we do have to be mindful that this is what we say about our own people in the community is going to be the basis for how people who are just now getting associated or involved or just barely dipping their toes in are going to think about things. So if you're just now coming into the community and all the major literature out there talks about brats as shitty subs, then you're going to think a brat's a shitty sub.
Yeah, which actually is a stereotype a lot of the old guard have, even a lot of the people coming in now. Well, I mean, we had the discussion in the brat episode, right? A lot of people just don't really get the back and forth of bratting, so it's just looked upon as like, oh, this person is just stubborn and uncooperative and not actually interested, when really the opposite is true.
Yeah. Like the opposite is true almost across the board. Like in the brat episode, I talked a lot about like different types of brats and how they present and what they want out of it. And brats all have different motivations. I would say that a true brat is less common than somebody who is like maybe a service sub brat who is bratting to get a desired outcome, or a bratty little that's trying to get a particular outcome. A true brat tends to be a little bit mouthier, a little bit harder to get around. You're gonna get sassed no matter what you do. It's gonna be very, very seldom. They're just gonna give in first time. But, if your only experience with brats is not actually somebody who is engaging in healthy bratting, it's somebody who is just a fucking bitch for no fucking reason, and they're calling it bratting as a way to excuse their behavior, you're going to have a really negative viewpoint on what a brat is.
Yeah,
And
and
I'm really big on calling that shit out. Like, if you hop onto my post where I'm being a little bit bratty and you are just being fucking awful, I'll be like, oh yeah, I'm not co-signing that. That was just rude.
yeah, and like
Holy
was
shit.
just pointed out in chat, one of the biggest stereotypes about it, that all brats need to be tamed, and then we would be good. Which
Exactly.
is, yeah, and it's that's
This is something I see a lot in the Facebook community too, and I personally will not follow pages for this, but there is a very popular page that makes a lot of memes that you see going around. But one of the things that they really talk about is breaking a brat and turning her into a good service sub. And I'm like, well, a lot of brats aren't service subs at all and never will be. So if you intend on breaking their personality and destroying parts of who they are to make them something else, you're not a dom, you're just an abuser. That's an abuse tactic, is taking somebody who won't conform to what you want and breaking them down emotionally and physically until they do is just abusive. If you want to be with a brat, be with a brat because you like brats. If not, look for a service sub. If not, look for whatever type of sub you want, but do not try to break somebody into something they are not. That's just being abusive. And there is an assumption that that is what brats want, that they want somebody to break them into whatever they're supposed to be for you. But that's just being an abuser. And it's not okay. If it is something consensual, there was a girl on my post, I think 3-4 days ago, that said she was a service sub, but she was working with her sir to become more of a service sub and stop with the bratty behavior. And for her, that was consensual. And I was like, I mean, I don't love it, but like, if that's something that you were interested in, it was something you consented to, I get it. Like, more power to you. The issue is that there is an assumption made that that's what all brats want. there's that big page that makes these memes, but half of his posts are like, oh, well, she's being shitty, so I'm not going to do anything nice for her. I'm not going to tell her I love her. I'm not going to praise her until she starts acting like the good service sub she is. Well, that's just shitty. If you're going to treat a brat like shit because she's being herself,
So
what
shitty.
message does that convey? That her personality isn't valuable and isn't worthy of love? Because that's fucked up.
Also, it doesn't go to
That's
explain like bratty doms at all. Not every brat's a sub.
No, and I would argue
That's
that
another shitty stereotype as
majority
well.
of doms are a little bit bratty. Like that's kind of what it takes to
Yeah.
be a dom.
I've heard Cat said that multiple times to me when
Yeah.
we've discussed
Doms,
things. That's what doms
doms
are.
are just brats with a god complex. I have that sticker on one of my servers. It's the facts. I'm sorry. Doms are just brats with a god complex.
Some
I
of
said
us
what
are
I
just
said.
gods with a brat complex.
Yep,
You wish. Literally nobody would co-sign that.
I co-sign that right now.
Oh, well, you don't even count, so it's fine.
What does that
I'm
mean?
sure. Kat, will you co-sign this with me? Will doesn't count?
Yeah, will you?
The echo, that was flawless.
I mean,
Embrace your inner brat, you can do it.
Think carefully. This podcast is temporary.
I can feel the nerves.
after the podcast.
Okay,
We'll write it up.
but I'd argue that like taking any kind of stereotype or what you believe someone should want or someone should be like, regarding anything, not just kink related, but just in anything, and applying it to that person and being like, no, this must be right. My interpretation of what I think about this person must be right, without actually like asking them about it or finding out,
Yes.
is very problematic just in general. You know what I mean? Like
Fully
it's
agreed.
it's part of why I think one of the basic tenets of kink and again relationships in general should be open and completely honest communication, because like
I agree.
otherwise what are you doing there? You're just living your idea in your head, and hopefully you're hoping the other person lives up to it, and that's just bullshit of the highest order. That's just not how anything works. It's especially not how it works in kink. But then people watch 50 Shades or Twilight and go like, no, this must be what healthy relationships are like. This must be what healthy kink would be. This is spicy kink.
50
You're like,
Shades leads me into another point too. That submissives are little wallflowers who are afraid of their own shadow, and they don't really come into their own until they become some sort of submissive or a dominant who gives them value. That's very much so the vibe that a lot of people seem to think, like, because I'm a submissive, I must be a little wallflower who's afraid of my own shadow and I'm super passive. One of the tropes is you can't even decide what to order yourself for lunch. Like, how are you supposed to make up your own mind on things? I don't think you know who the fuck I am, because let me tell you, I will eat you alive. I am not a wallflower. I am not afraid of conflict. In fact, I thrive on it. I am not afraid of going to war over the things that I believe in. And people often don't actually expect me to be a submissive when they get to know me, because I don't have what stereotypically looks like submissive energy. I am very, very self assured. I'm confident. I'm extroverted. I'm not afraid of my own shadow. And I am more than happy to go to war over anything that I feel is important. And then people find out that I'm submissive and they're like, well, how the fuck does that happen? How does that work? Like, how? Well, what I do sexually is not necessarily the same as like how I am in day-to-day life. And if you make the assumption that all doms are going to be strong-willed and really willing to boss people around 24/7, you're going to miss like 90% of the doms out there. Whereas I am like what most people think of as dominant when they're thinking about it stereotypically, and I couldn't be further from the truth. I'm the subbiest little sub. But
Right.
when
I
you
am
make that
often referred to
assumption,
as the nicest guy ever.
yes, I do frequently call him the nicest guy ever, when in fact he's mean when he wants to be. I actually have to keep him reeled in a bit so he doesn't bite people all the time on my server. But a lot of people look at me and they assume that because I'm submissive, I'm going to be sweet and gentle and kind and passive. And none of those things are necessarily true about me.
Now you're a pain in the ass.
That's also factual. 100% factual. I'm not going to deny it. Like, I am a former union president. I am an extreme extrovert. One of my hobbies is arguing with anti-vaxxers. I have a passion. What can I say? I am not afraid of conflict, whether it be online or in person, and people do not expect that from me. I will let things slide to a point, but when I decide I'm over it, people are usually shocked I have it in me because they assume because I was a submissive, I wouldn't be able to actually stand up to them. Or they assume that I'm into degradation. And if you don't know me, you don't have that rapport to me, don't you even fucking try it. I will make you cry. You don't degrade me unless you have that type of relationship with me. And if you think because I'm submissive, it's okay, I hope you're ready to cry because I will just be mean. You don't degrade somebody just because they're submissive. It's one of my biggest pet peeves is the
Yeah.
assumption that all submissives are into degradation. Couldn't be
No,
further from the
there's a
truth.
lot that are not. That's
And
people
a
who are into
lot of
degradation are
them,
rarer than common.
yeah, and a lot of people
Sure.
who are into BDSM aren't into impact either. So if you assume that all subs want to be spanked, you're probably going to get your ass kicked. That's not cool. Don't ever make that assumption. Don't ever hop
So
into my DMs
many.
or walk up to me and say like, "Oh, well, what if I told you I've got this giant paddle at home?" I'd be like, "Well, great. Can you shove it up your own ass? Don't talk to me." Why would you assume that that was something that I would be interested in?
I
Just the
find
assumptions, even in our community, are really big.
people who think they might be into degradation, like once they start to explore it, it's only because they haven't been praised, and that's actually what they want, but they just
Mhm.
didn't know it was an option.
Yeah.
Um,
Like they
it's,
wanted the
it's a,
praise, but they didn't know they could get praise or asked for praise. Or even some people think that asking for praise is inappropriate and unfair. But no, that is a perfectly valid thing to ask for.
yeah, for sure. But anything's a valid thing to ask for. Like, until you ask, you don't know it's an option.
Mhm.
So,
Nobody's gonna get hurt from it. You're allowed to have it.
You are allowed to have praise. You're allowed to be into degradation too, and you're allowed to
Mm-hmm.
dictate what types of degradation are okay. Like there's certain types of degradation that I can deal with in the moment, and I'll let you know if it doesn't work for me at the time. Like I'll be like, let's not do that. No, don't say that right now. Like, don't do that again. But there are periods of time where I can be into degradation, but that's something I have to communicate that I'm into at the time. Most of the time, I hate degradation. And there's a lot of brats who do hate degradation. Also, brats, everyone assumes that they want to be degraded and put in their place.
mm,
And oftentimes, brats like myself, we want you to play. We don't want you to degrade us or beat us into submission. Like I would rather you verbally like outdo me and get me to laugh, and then that is a type of submission at that point. If you can outwit me or if you can match wits with me, that is one of the easiest ways to get me to submit. But a lot of people assume that they need to degrade me, tell me something to put me in my place, like remind me of what my place is. And that's not how a lot of brats function. Some do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just because you see somebody as a brat doesn't mean you should make the assumption they want to be broken. In fact, I would argue very strongly brat tamer is not a good term. It's kind of like a lion tamer. If you stop a lion from acting like a lion, it's not really much of an adventure anymore. At best, you're just trying to work with a brat. You're trying to outbrat a brat. And that's more so what most brats are looking for than somebody to stop them from being themselves.
so you were saying about brats being playful. That's
Mhm.
for kink in general. For me, um, it's just another kind of adult play.
Mhm.
Like it's really no different from like sports, or
Exactly.
I don't know what people do outside of sports, but like that's sports is just
Playing with
it's got
balls is
so
this
much
kind
in
of
common
thing.
with it's got so much in common like with kink, but it's not seen as taboo. You know what I mean? Because like
Mhm.
there's equipment involved. There's a bunch of people. Well, kink doesn't always have a bunch of people, but a bunch of people
It
like
could.
working together with good communication, with rules set in place so nobody gets hurt. People are taken away from the sport when they've been injured. They're attended to straight away. That's aftercare. It's really no different.
Honestly, I'm surprised you didn't actually use the tabletop gaming comparison because that seems more up your speed. Tabletop gaming, there's like a huge overlap with tabletop gaming and the kink community in general. I would argue that a lot of the people who are into tabletop gaming, I would say at least 90% are also into kink in some way or another. But if you think about it, like it's very similar. There are rules, there are guidelines, everyone's playing a part. And there are rules set in place by the part that you're playing. Like if you're playing a certain type of character, that person's going to have like their own role to play, their own guidelines. And it's very similar. Like there is a certain element of role playing that is prevalent in almost all forms of kink. You have to play your part to a degree. But there are also rules in place, like you can't do something that isn't agreed to in advance. Like you've set up these guidelines, there are rules in place, and you can't just switch that up in the middle of the game without everyone's consent or without starting over.
Mhm.
It is I don't think enough of people appreciate like the fact that this is not just a rough and tumble, we're just doing whatever we feel like doing in the moment kind of thing. We have at length discussed and set up boundaries and guidelines and rules for the play, the adult play that we're engaging in. These things have been and should have been discussed well in advance of getting to that scene. This is not a spur of the moment, uh, just single encounter kind of thing. It's not like we're just hooking up and haven't discussed this at all. In general, by the time you get to the point where there's a scene, especially something with CNC or with a lot of power exchange, there will have been extensive discussions before that point. If
I'd
not, you are really, really in danger.
I'd say that's
And-
probably the most harmful part of the stereotypes, though, is because usually you get that. You get someone spontaneously doing things without
Hmm.
discussion because they have that stereotype in their head where this is what they'll want, this is what's okay, this is what's normal and acceptable in here. And then they'll just go off the rails and do the most insane, crazy shit. And you'll be sitting there be like, We didn't discuss this. What the fuck's going on?" And the person
Yeah.
just thinks they're doing the right thing.
Yeah. They thought that what they were doing was well within the realms of what's acceptable in kink, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Because the assumptions about kink don't actually make room for how much discussion and consent is involved. Like, we as kink practitioners have such a huge emphasis on consent that isn't necessarily communicated to the public. Like for us, like consent is the biggest part. There is nothing in our community that is not done or predicated around the concept of consent or applying consent to the scenario. It is such a huge part of our lives, but I feel like there isn't nearly enough of that in the stereotypes around. Like there's jokes about safe words, but the actual meaning of what a safe word is isn't inherently relayed to the public. They see it as like, oh, somebody's just yelling banana because it was too much for them. But no, that's not just the only reason you can use a safe word. Safe words can be used for anything. Like, hey, I have a Charlie horse and I'm going to need a minute. Like, if my ass does not stop hurting, I'm going to need you to stop being a pain in my ass. Like, these things can be used however you want them, and there shouldn't be limitations on how your partner uses safe words. And a lot of people, a lot of vanillas especially, tend to make jokes about how, oh, well, the safe word was flower, but she said flower instead. And I find that as somebody who is in the kink community, I find that deeply offensive and horrifying that that's even a joke that vanillas make.
It's
Like,
also
how
worrying
is
that
that
they're
okay?
joking about safe words. Just because it's
Mhm.
vanilla doesn't mean that it can't be unsafe.
Oh, yeah,
You know what I mean?
very
And
much.
that's and getting a little off track, but like vanilla stuff like that could benefit from the communication that we put in with kink in the same way that monogamous relationships could benefit from the communication you put in that you do in a polyamorous relationship.
Mhm.
Because a lot of the time you roll into vanilla sex, and say boy girl, they've got their positions, and everybody just goes ahead. Nobody discusses what that looks like.
Mhm.
Nobody knows what's going on until something goes wrong. And I feel like in a lot of the same way, I'm not shitting on vanilla people or monogamous relationships, but monogamous relationships, two people get together, they're in a relationship. They never discuss what each individually thinks is cheating and how those things might
Yes.
not line up.
This
Those kind
is
of things,
a
like they,
conversation that we've had
yeah,
about how important, how weird it is. I've been in some monogamous relationships. I've mentioned this in the podcast before. I've been in monogamous vanilla relationships in the past because, like, it's not necessarily a deal breaker for me, or at least wasn't in the past. It is now. Like, now I know that I'm not gonna like not have a BDSM centered relationship anymore because it just doesn't work it for me. And I feel like a lot of people who are vanilla and monogamous don't necessarily have the comprehension and understanding of communication and consent that I'm looking for personally. But one of the conversations that Prim and I've had in the past is when I was getting into relationships, I was always considered weird because one of the first things I did is talk about what I considered cheating versus what they consider as cheating. And a number of my exes went, I've never had this kind of discussion with a partner. And I was like, well, I don't see why not. Like, I would rather know like what your boundaries and what your guidelines on cheating and loyalty look like. Because for me, like what I would consider cheating is probably less extensive than what some other people would. Some people consider porn cheating, but they don't communicate that until their partner starts watching porn or is
Mhm.
watching porn and they find out about it. But if you're not communicating these things, people don't know where the boundaries are. And I think it's really, really important to our community to the point that we do discuss these things in advance. But this isn't something that's necessarily understood about us from the outside looking in. We are seen as, especially submissives, we don't really have a say. We don't really seem to have consent in the eyes of the vanilla audience at large. They think that we just enjoy being beaten and used. And while that is very true, it's not without consent. Like we are consenting to every single aspect, or we are not acting within the bounds of consent in BDSM. The second consent is lost, you are just an abuser.
I was gonna say that's a stereotype, right? The dom decides everything. The dom decides the limits.
Yes.
The dom decides, and the sub's just supposed to play along with it and not have their own opinions on anything, which is exactly not how we do things.
No, in fact, I mentioned this earlier. One of the funniest things for me is like how few DOMs are actually dominant, like in person when you're talking to them. A lot of times they're passive, they are laid back, they are not in control of everything, they don't want to be in control of everything. But you get into the bedroom, it's a completely different scenario. I would say like half the DOMs I've met
Yeah.
have like 100% less DOM energy in day to day life than I do. Like I am the person that walks into a room and I almost kind of take charge immediately. Not necessarily all the time, but like sometimes that's just how it is. I walk in, I tend to have a very dominant personality. I stand out from the crowd, and I'm oftentimes
Nobody
given
can see you in a crowd.
shush.
He's got you.
Ask Prim. I am inadvertently put in charge of things. How often? How often do I inadvertently become the leader of something? It's constant. I
Isn't you
inadvertently
just
am
stand
in
on the chair
charge
just to
of
be
things.
seen, though? And like, oh, she's the boss because she's hiding everyone
Look,
now.
look, on a chair, I still would be higher than most of you. We both know this.
No, you would
Anyway,
not.
I would not. But I know Prim will tell you, I will inadvertently get into positions where I am in charge of a new event or something, and I'm not
Phrasing.
really sure how it happened. It just does, and that's the energy that I
Phrasing.
bring to a conversation. It's like I just end up in charge of things. I don't mean to. It's not like I'm out to do it, but it happens. But when you're talking to doms, like dominants I've been with, like most of the time they don't have that energy at all. You would think that they are very passive, and I wear the pants in the relationship. Spoiler: I don't even own pants. All I wear is leggings. But there's the assumption that like this is something that carries over to day to day life. And a lot of times it couldn't be further from the truth. Somebody who is submissive in the bedroom is not necessarily submissive day to day. And same with dominance. Somebody who is dominant in the bedroom does not have to be in their day to day life. And I
Yeah, I
feel like
fit.
this isn't something that's understood.
Yeah, I fit that to a T. I am incredibly laid back and de-stressed as a person outside of the bedroom.
Yeah. A lot of people don't think that I am a laid back person. I am, but my energy is so I have very, very extroverted, strong, dominant energy. And a lot of people don't realize that I'm actually more laid back than people think. Like, I'm not going to jump down your throat unless you give me a reason to. But people tend to think that I am extremely dominant. Just that's the type of energy I
Yeah,
have.
usually you prefer other people
I'm
going down
not.
your throat. Ha 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 ha. Phrasing.
Well, I mean, I didn't say no, but yeah. Basically, yeah. People just don't appreciate that you don't have to be submissive at all times to be a submissive in the bedroom. Or to be a submissive, not even in a sexual dynamic. To be submissive is not necessarily even sexual. You can be submissive in any type of kink BDSM arena without it having to be sexualized. And you don't have to be submissive at all in your day to day life. There's a lot of like high powered jobs and roles in which the number of people who are actually submissives is way higher than you would think, but they're so used to being dominant and in charge in their day to day life that their type of release is to be submissive. And vice versa. There are certainly doms out there who are very used to not being in charge of anything, and then they get into the bedroom or get into a BDSM kink dynamic and they find their power by being dominants. And this isn't necessarily what the stereotype is. A lot of times the stereotype is that the guy who's like a major asshole and enjoys being women, he's also a dominant. And that's generally not very close to the truth at all, because we wouldn't let that type of guy in the community. He would be set on fire and kicked out. If somebody finds out that you're doing that just to do it, and it's not BDSM related, it's not consensual, the community will light you on fire. Like, you won't be welcome in any
As it should be.
circles, at any events. Like, we take this kind of thing very seriously. You cannot be in this type of community and be respected if we find out that you are non-consensually harming somebody or committing non-consensual acts against somebody. Once word of that spreads, like, you can't be in this community, you will find it really uncomfortable to be at any events or munches, because nobody wants you there.
If you're even
Which is
allowed
also
in.
another thing that could bleed over to like vanilla life as well. If more people who were doing non-consensual things to other people were kicked out of those communities, would be, across the board kind of helpful.
Yeah, like, it would be
We
fantastic.
hold
Like,
people more accountable, I feel.
we do. There is still accountability issues, but in general, it's hard to get away from things in this community, because as the second it gets out that you were doing anything non-consensual, like, that is the biggest taboo for us.
Mhm.
And the same thing is when I was talking about like things that are taboo for us in our community. One of the biggest ways to step outside of that taboo is for your quote unquote kink to involve people or things that cannot consent. If they
Mhm.
can't consent, that is a huge taboo for us. Which is why a lot of times sexualized little space is considered taboo, because if we are considering these people have age regressed, then if they are age regressed to 8 years old mentally, then why would you assume it's safe for them to consent?
Yep.
They can't. If it is truly an age regression, and that's what we're assuming is the case, that they are 100% age regressed, then that person should not be able to consent. Therefore, it is a huge taboo in our community to have sexualized little space. That's not to say people don't do it. And the ethical conversations on that is not something I'm going to talk about today, because that is a huge conversation. But there are people who do it, but it is still taboo for us. Majorly taboo for us. There is like a lot of assumption that all kinksters are into incest and stepbrother and stepmom and all that. That's actually very uncommon in our community. Like, that type of taboo is still taboo for us. Like, just because somebody has a daddy kink, that doesn't mean they want to actually fuck their dad. That's not how it works. The incest element of things is very, very uncommon.
It is incredibly pervasive in porn, however.
It is, and that is
Incredibly.
part of the
Which is,
stereotype. Yeah, it's part of the
Yeah,
stereotype.
I find a
People
lot of
assume that's true for us.
I find also in kink a lot as well, that we're not consumers of porn as often as vanilla people.
Because we can't find porn that actually actually portrays kink correctly.
Yeah, I think we just go out and ask other people who might want to do what we do to get the release that we would get from porn.
Or you record
You know what I mean?
yourself with your partners doing things if you need
don't know what
something to
you're talking
watch
about.
later. I wasn't judging,
Which
but
is
you're gonna
always
narc on
fun.
yourself. Yeah, like, I actually make a lot of memes about this too, like home movies. It's very common in kink because we can't actually find porn that actually correctly portrays what we're doing. We will make our own.
Well,
Because
we
the
can't find it that
stereotypes.
portrays it safely either, because the stereotypes bleed
No,
over into porn.
Well, it's not even
and
just
exactly.
the stereotypes about
part of
kink.
where it
I'm
comes from as well.
demisexual. I can't. It's
Mhm.
just so plastic and so fake. None of it's. I can't.
Yeah,
Actual like
exactly.
produced porn. It's just
Me,
gross.
for me, it's like you have to like erase the faces of everybody involved in order for it to be palatable. And some people can't do that, and that's fine. I don't watch porn because I don't really get anything out of it. I will usually look for porn on a specific topic if I'm trying to find a screenshot, which is hilarious. It's actually something I do for my page. It is difficult, and I actually know Prim has done this too. I think we had a whole conversation of him trying to find a very specific image, and he had to go through a lot of very, very sad porn to find it. Do you remember this one,
Oof.
Prim?
You'd have to be less vague than that. My brain doesn't grasp memories very well.
He was looking for specific porn. I think it was lesbian porn that he was trying to find something, a specific screenshot. And he couldn't find it like in any still images. So he was watching through and screenshotting porn to find the correct image, which is one of those things that as kink admin we don't talk about, but like it's a very weird thing to be a kink admin making kink related memes, because you would be surprised how often you have to go out looking for very specific things.
Yeah,
And you
Sprika,
just can't find it.
they said that's why they read theirs, which I'm very much 100% support.
Can't just find a stock image of this stuff, you know?
Yes, you can't just find a stock image of people doing very specific things. Like I
I know.
had to like put out my feelers once and I asked like 7 or 8 different admin
I
to go
agree,
through their
Rika.
hentai collections
I
to
read
try to
mine
find
too.
a specific image.
Yeah,
It was like one
erotic video
specific
strips
image I
is better.
needed. Oh yeah.
Why put it up to the vagaries of some weird ass fucking production team that has like a weird script? Nah, I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna go on Literotica or something, and I'm gonna just search the tag of what I want, and that I'm happy boy. Why? That's just so much better to me.
I have
But
audio, but
I remember the one thing that I was looking for. I was looking for a very specific thigh grinding like art. Like I wanted art. I didn't want porn of it. I wanted art because I had a specific meme idea that I wanted to execute that I couldn't find any good thigh grinding hentai. And I knew it was out there, but I couldn't find it under any searches. I ended up putting out my feelers and talking to 5 or 6 different kink admin to see if they had anything in their porn stockpiles because we all have it because we make memes if they had anything in their hentai stockpiles that would actually fit that role. I ended up getting 3 images sent to me. Neither or none of them actually were exactly what I wanted. And it was
I actually
very,
know the
very
meme you're talking
difficult.
about.
You remember? Yeah, you remember this one. It was the
Yeah.
wiping it on your thigh before you took a bite. Yeah,
Yep.
it was terrible. It's terrible, and I never did find the perfect meme for it. But I had this whole idea, and it took me days to find an image that would work. And this is something we run into a lot because actual kink and things that happen in kink, thigh grinding is actually very, very common, especially in the DDLG, daddy dom, little girl, like brat dom dynamics. Like this is very common. The thigh grinding. It's a type of humiliation. It's degradation. It's very, very common to see, but there was like no actual imagery I could find associated with it. And everyone knew what I was talking about because it's something that does happen in the community, but there's just not an understanding of it in the stereotypes of kink, so there's not really art of it. The other thing I wanted to discuss was Haunting Adeline. Prim has been reading this aloud in our
Oh.
server. It's fucking terrible. It is
it's so
so
bad.
bad. It's so bad. It really is like the absolute fucking worst. So much worse than 50 Shades, which I know will be controversial, but it's terrible. And the way that they present kink, it's very much so like somebody Googled it and read the stereotype of one type of kink, and they're just trying to put as many random types of kink that they've never heard of into this book. And some of the stuff they mentioned, like we all had to stop and go, that's not how that works. But what it was like this person who's writing it had literally no idea what the kink was, and they Googled it and found the first stereotypical answer and tried to incorporate it into the story in like a one-liner.
Just use the Urban Dictionary version of
Yeah,
it.
like
Yeah.
this stereotype, you can always
Oh.
tell when somebody hasn't actually practiced it or hasn't actually been in the community because sometimes they will say something about a particular kink and they will have it so fucking wrong, and you're just gonna be like, where did you even find that definition? But it's somebody wrote it incorrectly on Urban Dictionary or something, and then it got presented in a book like Haunting Adeline, and all of a sudden that's the overwhelming consensus of what that kink looks like. And it just keeps
Imagine that
happening.
being your stereotype.
Oh my god, Haunting Adeline. Like, there's so many vanilla people who love it, who are going to get a really, really incorrect idea about consent and how things work within
It's
BDSM.
just
It's
rape
scary.
fiction. That's what
It
that
is.
is.
Like, I think that like this whole dark fantasy thing, like it's fine, but we have to be very clear that these are not kinks that are being presented because kink would require there be consent of some sort. Unless you present the entire thing as a giant role play, which you could argue, but I think a lot of this is really damaging for kink in general to have this type of thing portrayed. I really hate that book.
Outside of the scope of everything wrong in the book, just the writing is so awful. It's an affront to my brain.
Uh,
It's
well, I've made a
so
couple of
fucking
different
awful.
memes on this one. It was a bird in the hand, 3 in the bush,
Mm.
and then palms sweaty, lube your subs Puschetti. Like, we were making
Yeah.
some really fucking terrible jokes about how fucking bad the scenes in this book were. Like she was talking
Well,
about this whole like fingering session they were having being the best sex she'd ever had in her life, and we were all just like, well, we just feel bad for her now. This is the
The,
peak for you, babe.
the
Are you
second book
okay?
is terrible. I've
Oh
read
my
both
god.
the first and the second. It never gets better at
Bless
all.
you. I'm so sorry for your suffering.
Thank you, thank you. No, it's the train wreck you can't stop watching. Essentially,
I
it's
feel
the
like
only
that's
reason
true.
I read both.
Because I've had multiple people ask me when Prim's gonna read more of the book again because everyone looks forward to it just because it's so fucking terrible.
I get so angry.
Oh, we all do though.
Now, when do we set it up where we get different people to voice act the different characters in the book with Prim just narrating? And
I
we do like
voice
a
act all
shadow
the characters
cast.
as it is, and they're awful.
He does. He does. He did what was it, like a Southern American accent, but like it was obviously also kind of Scottish or something. Like you couldn't quite nail the
Everything
accent. It
changes.
was terrible. It was the
I can't
police
know any
officer
of the
guy.
accents. That's the worst part. No matter
That would
what I
be a
do,
fun
that
bonus.
Australian sneaks in there about like 40% of the accent.
Oh yeah, it was great. He was portraying the cop, and he was trying to do like a American South accent. It was not American South, but it was fucking funny. It was
You
like
know what? It's still
picture a
better than the fucking book, though.
it's still better than the book, yeah. Like picture an Australian who is trying really, really, really hard to have a Southern drawl, but failing catastrophically and somehow sounding Scottish.
Give us a sample.
No, I'm good. I was after Mouse's amazing
it.
sell, 10 out of 10 review of my accent there. I think I'll
The
keep this just for
curiosity is
research.
there. You gotta tune in.
Oh gosh. Yeah, we're gonna have to actually start like recording some of his readings because
We
we're all like
really don't need to do that.
hyperventilating. Well, I mean, it would
Good.
also have all of the commentary from the entire server just dying about what you just said.
Yeah, we spend more time bitching about the book than we do reading it.
Mouse,
What was
we
it about
can.
the missing mailbox that was like somehow threatening but also not there? I remember
that
we
was-
were all furious
Yeah.
about this, and then we couldn't figure out why this was even brought up, like why it was relevant.
We could find different inserts from smut books that are just terrible representations of kink.
Oh gosh,
And
we
do,
could
like,
do a whole
openings.
episode on that. We could do a whole episode about terrible, like, individual representations between, like, 50 Shades and other, like, dark fantasy books that are so fucking bad. Like, I think we could do, like, a whole episode just completely dismantling how fucking terrible Haunting Adeline is. We could probably do,
That
like, a
would
whole
be great.
series on it, chapter
would
by
be great.
chapter, why this is so fucking terrible. Oh my god.
Spark notes.
A spark notes of, please don't read this. This is the worst. book
The
that has ever
only
been written.
negative part of that is that for us to do that properly, we were all gonna have to actually sit and actually fucking
Book club it.
read them.
We're
Yeah.
gonna book club it. Oh my god.
I don't know if we'd survive.
I'd
Oh,
survive.
we would all lose our brain cells one at a time.
That'd be real rough.
But yeah, I mean,
I'm actually
Well,
looking forward to reading the Chuck Tingle books in BC.
oh
least
yeah,
they're
yeah.
written by-
Chuck Tingle?
He,
Is it the Chuck Tingle
Mhm.
I'm thinking of? He wrote books?
Well, if it is, yeah.
Oh my god.
The Endless Run On. Is that it? Is that the same one?
I don't know.
Uh,
Prim recently
don't know
bought
that
one. It
one.
was like a lesbian novel about pumpkin spice lattes.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just check my Kindle while I'm here, and I'll update you.
I
He's
just
been
got
meaning to read it
through-
aloud, but we haven't gotten around to it.
The toxic Emily McIntyre books of the
Mm.
Disney villain rewrites.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
I only really liked one out of like the 7.
I
I've
don't know.
realized.
I've seen a lot of like book talk books that have been coming out recently that are all supposed to be about kink and CNC. None of them hit the mark, and I think that that is something that's going to feed into a lot of really, really dangerous stereotypes that are going to show up in the community in the next couple of years. I think we're going to have to be very
Mhm.
cautious about people whose understanding of CNC and impact and other kinks that have been completely and totally predicated on books from book talk right now, such
A
as Haunting
lot
Adeline.
from this newer generation, especially because it's
Yeah.
so easy to get a hold of a lot of those books. Books like that. I mean, the Amazon Kindle app. A lot of people don't worry about child restrictions or things like that with any type of books because they just see a kid reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially book talk, like TikToks about book talk are not really being well regulated to keep them away from kids or from people who may be vulnerable. And I think that a lot of these book talk books that are being explained and topics explained or excerpts read from the books on book talk are going to have a negative overall detriment on pretty much all of our community because we're going to see a lot of these people coming in with these ideas that this is how a dom in a CNC scenario will act. And that's 100% not how they should be acting unless you want to be in very serious danger with that person because they're not actually a dom, they're just a predator.
I mean, that's
I
not
think
entirely new either. I mean, 50 Shades, I'd argue did the same exact thing. You know,
50
every time there's some
Shades
popularized
is
ridiculous
I
example.
I will caution that 50 Shades is a lot more tame than this book, The Haunting Adeline.
Oh no,
The
but
things that are
the point is that there's always going to be some popularized kind of fiction that kind of gives rises to an incorrect stereotype. Like that's always been the thing. There's always
it's
been
also
waves of that.
slightly different though because it's now so mainstream. There was still a little bit of taboo around 50 Shades when it came out, but
Mm,
with the rise of TikTok and book talk making it so normal that every vanilla lady's reading it and it's becoming
Mm.
normalized and mainstream and just the amount of younger people, a lot of younger people didn't read 50 Shades. Like my age group, I don't know very many people who did until they got older. But a lot of the younger people now, like Gen X or Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they are having exposure to this and they're coming into they're becoming sexually mature and like actually getting a hold of literature like this at a very young age and it's going to be formative to a degree. They're going to look at this and think that this is how kinky hot sex is presented in literature and that's how it is being presented. And if that's going to be their first look at it and they're forming their ideas around sex around things that are like porn and things like Haunting Adeline, that's going to create some serious issues, things that have to be unlearned in order to safely engage in kink and BDSM.
I
And I
think
think we're
that's
going
the
to see a
same
lot more of that come up.
as old people like me growing up. Like first seeing like porn on the internet, you know, as we like reached like pubescence, and that changing the way, like, you know, or putting in our heads the idea of the way sex is from porn, that
Hmm.
is damaging in and of itself. But kink
Hmm.
is a whole another thing that
Yes.
kids growing up getting the wrong idea from is potentially much more
Yeah.
damaging.
A young girl
Um,
who's read Haunting Adeline and really enjoyed it, meeting an older predatory male who is telling her that it's going to be just like Haunting Adeline when in fact he's just essaying her repeatedly. I can
well,
see that happening, honestly, because this is so normalized in this book and it's talked about as being sexy. And there's no talk about like what it should look like if you're actually going to be into CNC. Like even
yeah,
their
there's no talk of consent at all, and so
no, and
they
even
will
in
go
their
in
like
not
spoiler
expecting that.
books and their like warning books where they talk there's that warning website that talks about like all of the triggers that are in there. It doesn't actually talk about how none of these things should be done as they're represented in the book. There's no discussion that this is not what the kinks actually look like. There's no warnings there. And kids who are getting a hold of these books and it's becoming their formative understanding and how they're going to stereotype kink and sexual relationships that are based off of these things, we're going to have a lot of unlearning to do in order to get to the point where they can safely consensually engage in these kinks. So I fully expect to see like on my page in the next year or so, because I do a lot of CNC related memes, that I'm probably going to see some people who will start to say things that sound a lot like they're from Haunting Adeline, like they heard or they saw this represented in the book this way, and they're going to have this idea that CNC is just something you can do with any partner without actually consenting and talking about it.
Yeah, building on that, Mouse, I definitely also see from the other end that this can bring up some. God damn, I lost the word. Unfair fantasies against like doms too, because you're not gonna
Hmm.
really find doms that actual doms, not just abusers, that will do that stuff to you either.
Hmm. Yeah, because most DOMs will
That are
not.
gonna fulfill these
Well,
fantasies that you don't know better.
let me add the caveat. Like, while I was about to say most DOMs wouldn't do this with the consent. Some would.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't actually be DOMs. And there's a lot
Mhm.
of DOMs in the community who, like any men, any women, like don't necessarily understand how to apply consent. This is something I think we should also talk about at some point, like the difference between understanding consent and actually applying consent to real life scenarios. This came up recently in my server, and it came up on the Facebook community recently. There's a very big difference between understanding consent, the buzzwords, how to say it, and actually applying it to real world scenarios. Even if somebody's telling you, saying, I want you to do this to me, that is not enough. Informed
Mhm.
consent is essential. Just because they're saying that that's what they want, that doesn't mean that they actually understand what they're asking for, what you are inferring they mean. Like if I
Mhm.
say I want to engage with CNC with somebody and they don't ask me like what type of CNC I mean, we're going to end up having two very different ideas in all likelihood of what I'm asking for. Consent isn't just getting a yes or getting an implied yes, especially not an implied yes. I hate the idea of implied yes in consent. Like, that should not be a thing. There should be discussion at all times. And unless you guys are on the same page 100% of the time, we're going to run into issues. And I think that a lot of times when we see people who, they might consent to doing this, that doesn't mean they're adequately explaining or safely executing a consensual discussion. Like, consent isn't just saying yes. Consent is a lot more than just yes or no. And that's not something that's being accurately conveyed by any of these current literatures out there. And even more than that, if they go out to try to find a dom who will, do this, do they safely know how to ask for this or what to ask for? That's what I'm thinking we're going to see in the next couple of years. It's going to be pretty scary. I fully expect to see a lot of discussion on women thinking that this was something they wanted to engage in and finding out that it was not at all what they expected. And being upset and traumatized and needing therapy. And I hope it wouldn't turn into like SA cases, but like if not all parties are consenting appropriately, it could. I just find this book extremely scary.
Which is why we should
horror novel.
We should be pimping out Chuck Tingle books.
Oh God, yeah.
The pumpkin spice latte one I was going to read in server. I just pulled the name of it up. It's this pumpkin spice latte gets me off in a fun and sincere way because it's okay for people to enjoy popular things without being shamed for the perceived basicness of their beverage choices.
Beautiful. Flawless. Chuck Tingle, the real kink icon we never knew we needed.
I don't know how to feel about that.
He seems too good to be true. I'm waiting for it to come out that he's some kind of like conservative plant, just because he seems like such a legit dude.
I kind of expect him to actually write a novel about a MAGA plant who is like super into kink.
There
an
are
actual plant who
definitely.
believes.
Yeah, well, look, there's certainly a MAGA dinosaur books that he's written.
Or a high number of dinosaur books.
I think there's one about President Tyrannosaurus having sex with Air Force One.
Yep. Yeah, that sounds right.
Wow.
I know he's written trans-friendly like Harry Potter satire, which I've heard from more than a handful of trans people saying it's actually really good and quite a lot better than Harry Potter.
There's also like really on the nose jokes in there. I know, like on the nose, like, yes, I'm actually gay, and I'm not going to say that, or I'm not going to just not say anything, and then claim later, years later, in a tweet that it was implied in the subtext of the book all along. It was stunning.
Yeah, that's I didn't know that's what his content was about. That's interesting.
He's written. It's bizarre. It's good, but it's bizarre.
One thing I can say is that as a kink admin, I post a lot of kinky related stuff. He shows up in my suggested feed quite often. He and his books do, which should tell you a little bit about how Facebook like recognizes his books versus my content. Apparently, we're similar enough. I get his suggestion stuff a lot.
Chuck Tingle.
I wonder if it's because he writes books about healthy consensual sex.
That would be a huge bonus.
So anyway, we are 15 minutes over time, 16 minutes over time now.
We had a 15-minute derailment due to Haunting Adeline. We apologize.
What are we discussing in 2 weeks? That's my question. What's our next episode?
Not Haunting Adeline.
Not Haunting Adeline.
No,
I did mention things about like talking about consent and applications of consent rather than just consent itself, like applications of real world topics in consent. Public consent was another one that was talked about a lot on Facebook, and I think we could do a lot with talking about public consent and why things are or are not okay.
Yeah, we could do that. Ideas? Any other suggestions? Any other ideas from anybody? I'll take that.
Not Haunting Adeline.
Not Haunting Adeline. I think there's a lot we could discuss, but, like, what's stuck in
Oh,
my head
there's
right
not.
now is public consent because there was
Mhm.
there was a huge discussion on it this week
Yeah.
on the Facebook kink front. I made a large post on my page about it, but I think there's a lot to cover about public consent and how consent should be applied in real world scenarios because it's not just important if you know how to use the buzzwords and talk about consent and enthusiastic yes and all the other buzzwords that we use within consent to talk about what is and is not consensual. We also have to know how to apply it. And like vetting wise, like how do you know that somebody's understanding consent? Like I think we could also do another episode on vetting eventually too, because I think vetting would be a good one.
I think that would be really nice too to go with that episode.
Like
Honestly.
consent and vetting.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do that next week. Consent and vetting.
Consent and vetting. Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah, I would like that. That'd be great.
All right. So then we will meet back again. And that will be June the 7th at that point. We're already in June. God damn. Meet back
I
on June the
know.
7th, and we will discuss consent and vetting. So
Sounds
I hope you
good.
guys all enjoyed listening and chatting with us. And if you need more information about any links to anything or different socials and whatnot, you can just Google Starbright Podcast and you will find it linked in the descriptions of any of the YouTube videos. Any of the past episodes are there if you want to listen to other things we've talked about. They're all there for your viewing pleasure. And we will see you guys again June 7th. Leave a like, subscribe, follow, whatever platform you're on. And have a good one, guys. See you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.